Hello, Tungsten Miner here. This time I'm going to carry on with my series on immersive engineering. Last time we had talked a bit about blast furnaces, the revolver, and walked through the entire setup for producing and consuming diesel fuel. So let's move on. Next up, I'm going to talk about the mining drill. This is another one of those handheld tools, similar to the pistol, that gets built on the engineer's workbench. The mining drill itself is built from a heavy engineering block with steel mechanical components and a grip. And you also need one of these iron or steel mining heads, drill heads. And that's a block of iron or steel with steel and or iron around it. Once you've built one of these things, you need to get some fuel into it. So you can see right now it's telling me that it's empty. So I've got over here the beginnings of a bottling machine. So I right-click the very front of this conveyor belt, and it turns it into a bottling machine. Now I've got a tank over here which is supplying diesel, and therefore when this thing bottles whatever it bottles, it's going to bottle diesel into it. I've got in here a full and an empty jerry can. Now these things are just iron around buckets, and they allow you to store up to 10 buckets worth of whatever fluid you've got. So for example, if I toss this thing onto the conveyor belt, yeah, it's probably having problems because this guy, whenever you make a machine, if you already have the connectors in place, it tends to ignore them for some reason. So just have to reconnect these guys. And now you should be getting power, and we'll toss this on again. No, that clearly was not what it was complaining about. There it goes. And the little head moves around, fills it up, and the jerry can is now full in both sides. So if I come over here and I toss my mining drill onto the conveyor, it's a little fussy. You know what? This might be a little bit easier if I do this. There it goes. Fuels it up, and then drops it into my test. So now I've got a full mining drill. And the mining drill works basically like you'd expect it to. So, all right, let me change my game mode back to survival. And if I just left click on these blocks, you can see it starts going after a couple blocks at a time. Not quite as slow as your regular pickaxe would be. So let's take a look at some of the improvements now that we can add to this thing. Toss this back on the engineering workbench. You can see that it's taken some damage, the drill head. I can repair that with an anvil in the usual way, just by adding more iron to it. But I can also add a steel drill head, which is a bit harder and drills obsidian like a diamond pickaxe would. It's also a bit faster and does more damage to creatures that you might attack, and has an improved drilling area. So let's swap that out. You can see this is a lot smaller and has less of all those capabilities. So now with a steel drill head, I can get rid of a lot more stuff all at once. And the durability is quite a lot higher. Some of the other things we can add, pressurized air tank, which allows us to drill underwater. So we can toss that in there. And now you can see the teeny little blue tank on the side of it there. And let me grab myself a splash potion so we can see what's going on when I jump under. All right. And down here, I can drill not only at normal speed, but I can drill at all, because this thing normally wouldn't be able to drill in any case. You can also see that it gives me kind of an indication, that little square the black outline, where I'm going to wind up drilling. This is kind of handy. And head back over here, drop off the mining drill. I can also add in a larger tank so that it can have more fuel. And I can add in additional augers so that it does more damage. And you can add up to 3 of those at a time. So if we add in all of the possible bits here, the lubrication system, so this makes it go even faster. So let me swap that out. So now we can see all of the enhancements actually do show up on the tool itself. So if I drop it off over there, we can take a look and see. There's the lubricating unit. There's the extra tank. I think that's the extra tank. Yeah, anyhow. They go to such great attention to detail in this mod. So now you can see how much faster it winds up being with the lubrication system. All right, and then the last thing, of course, is just show off a couple of different shaders. You know, a red one and kind of a steely sort of gray one. There are many, many shaders that come with this mod, so you generally find them either in loot chests or in shader grab bags, which are really just kind of an undecided shader that doesn't have a specific name on it, and you open them up by right-clicking, and that gets you the rest of them. Okay, so next up, let's talk about this engineer's toolbox. This is an item that you craft with some treated wood and aluminum plate and some dye. And then when it's in your hotbar and you right-click with it, it opens up a GUI with a whole bunch of storage, basically. So you've got a little place to store food, and only food can go in these slots. You've got a little place to store tools, and only tools can go in these slots. You've got a little place to store wiring, so all of your connectors and things to do with immersive engineering power. And then finally, you've got some slots to store anything at all, whatever you happen to have. Really nice way to expand your inventory a little bit and to keep certain useful things on hand. Next, let's talk about this chemical thrower. So any kind of liquid can be loaded into this chemical thrower and tossed about. So let me, for example, take it and just add some diesel to it. It's going to go through the bottling process and wind up back in this inventory over here. And now I've got a diesel-loaded chemical thrower. Now, it also has a flamethrower kind of attachment, so I can shoot diesel out into the world. Oh, I was expecting that to ignite. Why is it not igniting? There we go. I had to shift and right-click to change modes, so I can turn on and off the ignition system. So we can drop this on the workbench, the same as anything else, and add our various improvements. This guy gives you more range, but decreases the spread. So you can see I can hit that from all the way over here now, but it's a much narrower beam. And then the larger tank allows us to keep more fluid in there at any one time. Both pretty handy tools to have. The chemical thrower is especially handy when you're trying to clear out some kind of foliage. Not entirely sure why it didn't work on those logs, but it certainly works on leaves, and it definitely works on mobs. And then the mining drill is a fantastic tool. If you're using this in combination with Tinker's Construct, you might find that you do better with the hammer, but if you don't have Tinker's Construct, this is a really fabulous tool. And even then, it's a close fit because this thing can be refueled pretty easily with diesel, which, as you can see, once you've got the setup for it, is really cheap to produce. Just a little, bit of wheat, and you're all set. Yeah, so that's it for the chemical thrower and for the mining drill. Next up is to talk about this external heater. What it basically does is it takes power and it makes it so that you don't need furnace fuel. So any furnace which happens to be next to an external heater which is receiving power will automatically smelt whatever is tossed into it. So I could have just made an example where there's an external heater and one furnace next to it, but that's hardly very interesting. Instead, what I've done is I've put 3 of them, and I could in fact have put 4, with some dropping conveyor belts and regular conveyor belts. So I've got kind of a system for doing automatic smelting pretty cheaply with just furnaces here and an external heater there. These conveyor belts keep catching me as I get too close. They're very good at that. And then I've got hoppers underneath the furnaces, so all of the smelted goods drop down onto the conveyor belts, which then get moved along to the chest. And I happen to have some ores of various kinds, which we can try this out on. So as I toss some of these ores up here, you can see that, yeah, some of them are bouncing right off. They're going to get distributed to all of these various furnaces because this first furnace has iron ore in it, and so the bauxite ore and the lead ore couldn't go in there. It had to go over here instead, and then the lead ore had to go all the way around to here because that one was finished. And the furnaces can only have one thing in them at a time. But you can make your furnaces line up using these conveyor belts so that as the items come up here, they go through and drop into this first one if it can, but if it can't, it keeps going until it drops in here if it can, but if it can't, it keeps going until it gets here, drops in there if it can, but if it can't, well, it's back at the beginning of the loop. So any items which can't drop into one of the furnaces because they happen to be busy at the moment will just keep going around the loop until one of the furnaces is freed up. And that way you don't lose any items and you don't have to have an infinite number of furnaces. Eventually, all of the stuff winds up back in this chest at the bottom here. Next up, I'm going to talk about some of the decorative cabling that we have. So here we have hemp rope coil, which is just the industrial fiber around a stick, and we have steel cable, which is, not surprisingly, steel around a stick in the same pattern. And then finally, the structural cable connector, which is steel fences and steel ingots, and that gets you a bunch of these. Oh, and then finally, there's this engineer skyhook. So anybody who's played the BioShock Infinite game probably recognizes this as a way to grab onto cables and swing through the air. So if I point this at my connector, and this could be an insulator or it could be this structural cable connector, anything that a wire can end on, and hold down right click, I will travel from wire to wire until I get to the very end of the system. If I grab on and let go at some point, I just drop off wherever it is I happen to let go. I cannot, though, grab the wire directly, so I have to make it at least to the nearest connector to keep going. This can form a really interesting and exciting way of getting around the map really, really quickly. Because as you see here with the steel cable, I can stretch with one cable 32 meters, which is, you get 4 of them with each recipe, right? So every steel ingot gets you 32 meters along the map. Whoops, I grabbed the wrong cable. Standing a little too close. So we'll go back along the steel cable. And of course, you can't get lost. And of course, you can go over pretty broad gulfs in the terrain. So instead of making bridges, you can do this. Imagine, for example, if you took these structural cable connectors and started attaching them to various points in the roof of the Nether. This could get you over some pretty nasty gaps that maybe once you manage to find a way around and get from place to place, but from that point forward, you just install these things and you can move really, really conveniently and fast. Very, very handy. So that's hemp cable and structural cable along with the Skyhook. Next up, we're going to talk about a couple of different light sources that Immersive Engineering adds. The first is just this regular lantern here. And the lantern itself is It's one of many things in my mod pack, apparently. Here it is. And I'll be talking about that one in just a second. So the recipe for this guy here requires some glowstone, but pretty mundane stuff apart from that, just glass and iron. So once you make your first trip to the nether and get yourself some glowstone, you can start making these guys. And basically they work a lot like torches, except one, they look kind of cool. And two, you can plant them on the ceilings of things, which of course you can't do with torches. You can attach them to wooden posts in the normal way, so you can put them above, directly on the post, or on the sidearm, just as you would for any kind of other connector. Over here, I have a powered lantern. Now the powered lantern looks very similar, although it's a bit bigger, except it requires power, as you might expect. So if I throw the switch, light comes on, throw the switch, light goes off. And I've got a little bit of power here. But what are these compass arms all about? Well, it turns out the powered lantern has the ability to prevent mobs from spawning within a 32-meter radius of the lantern, which basically means in a box that you draw from point to point to point around this thing, no mobs will spawn. Now, it does require a small amount of power. Your windmills would be quite sufficient, though, to power this thing. So you can actually produce a really widespread anti-mob zone and just wall in the outside edges of this and know that you're perfectly safe within whatever base you've got. So maybe if you set up 4 of these things with just slightly overlapping fields, you could get yourself like a 64 by 64 meter space, or even bigger, that mobs can't spawn in for the cost of providing it a little bit of power. And you can see it's a fair bit of space, right? These are all 32 meters long. Next up, we have the Floodlight. Now, the Floodlight is a directional light that also prevents mob spawning, but works a little differently. So here you need some copper wire, some stained glass, iron, and iron mechanical components, which is really just copper with iron in the corners. And I'm going to turn off the lights here so that we can see a little more clearly what's going on. So if I throw this switch, the floodlight starts warming up and shoots out light far, far, far off into the distance. In fact, if we fly up here, we can see quite how far it goes, which is basically 32 meters, a little bit extra even, off into the distance. And, as you might expect, let me turn on... so NEI has this great feature where it can show you areas that are dark enough for mobs to spawn. So you can see within that arc, there's nowhere that's dark enough for mobs to spawn, only outside of that floodlit region. Now, using your engineer's hammer, you can also adjust the position of this thing. So you can see now the cone is facing upwards a bit more. And if I shift click, I can turn it downwards, and only to a certain extent downwards. There you go, that's kind of as far down as it goes. But you can turn it way, way up and off in different directions. And so thereby change where the light goes. It takes a few seconds for the lighting to catch up with wherever you've got it pointed. So just give it a moment for it to catch up to anything that you might have done. And as soon as I turn off the juice, the light starts cooling down and eventually goes out. So let me get some sunlight back here. All right, so that is the floodlight, the powered lantern, and the regular lantern. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it off for this time. So in addition to the lights, if you can see it way back there, we talked a bit about the mining drill and the chemical thrower and the bottling plant to fill them up. And we talked a bit about the external heater and how you can use that to power ordinary vanilla furnaces, along with, of course, all the lights. So next time, we've got some more heavy machinery and item routing, and that may be the last video in the series. So if you like this video, hit like. If you want to know when that next video is ready, hit subscribe, and I will talk to you later.